Are you having trouble finishing a book? Feeling like you're no longer a reader? Or want to get into reading but always end up taking a nap? Introducing Twirling Pages Reading Slump Prescription. With this cure, reading will feel like a breeze in no time. Hello, I'm Alexandra and I am your resident reading expert. As someone who was in a reading slump for over 5 years, I feel like I finally cured my reading slump. There's a couple parts to this because how did I even get into a 5-year reading slump? And I think this is helpful to give a little bit compassion to yourself if you're in a reading slump or if you've never been a reader. But if you want to skip directly to the tips, I have timestamps below. So around 5 years ago, my favorite genre was YA, and also around that time I was no longer a young adult. I was starting to feel like I couldn't really connect with my favorite genre, which also meant that I didn't really like all the books that I was reading and I didn't know what I liked to read. So basically I had a reading identity crisis, which I think is a common cause for reading slumps, where people suddenly realize that they've grown out of a genre that they love, but they don't know what to read instead, or they feel like they should read XYZ because it fits their current age, but actually they don't like reading that genre. All of this to say is that try to be compassionate to yourself and really trust your gut of what you like to read, and don't feel embarrassed for the types of books that you like to read. I honestly felt that I needed to read more literary fiction or classics because I wanted to be that girl. And I do really like literary fiction now, but there was a period of time where I felt like I was forcing it. So don't do that, because then you will get into a deeper slump. Just read what you like to read, and if you don't like it, don't be afraid to DNF the books, because maybe you'll like it in a different place in your life. So the other thing that I think is common is that people who used to like reading when they were younger but no longer read anymore struggle with a reading slump because they don't have the time to read anymore. So in those scenarios, I think it's super important to acknowledge and be realistic with yourself that you cannot put the same expectations as yourself as when you were younger and you had a lot more free time. Usually as we get older, we have less and less free time because now we're working adults or in college, and college was a lot, and you simply just don't have the time to do school or work, have a social life, relax / read, and have all of these other responsibilities of your life. So there was a period where my reading slump got worse because I felt bad that I wasn't reading 60 books a year anymore, and I felt I'm constantly in a slump because I'm only reading I don't know, 10 books this year, or I'm not reading as much as I used to. But maybe that's just your new pace. So all of this is to say, try to avoid engaging in these thought patterns. They will probably make your reading slump worse. Now that we have that out of the way, let's get into some of my prescriptions for if you are in a reading slump or if you want to get into reading and you just have trouble getting into it. First things first, make reading fun. I think an easy way to do this is to schedule reading dates. What this looks like is that you and your friend or friends will hang out and we'll all read together. And I feel like this is really helpful because once you're surrounded by other people physically reading, then I feel naturally I feel more motivated to keep reading, which is also why reading sprints or joining a book club is really helpful in my opinion, because it kind of forces you to read, but also in an enjoyable and at your own pace type of way. I'm going to shamelessly plug my own book club, which is Subtle Asian Book Club. I want to express a lot of gratitude to SABC because I feel like if not for SABC, I probably would have really gone down the deep dive of not reading at all. SABC is honestly one of the few reasons why I've been able to keep up with creating book content as well, because I feel otherwise I wouldn't be so inspired or encouraged to continue being a part of the book community as my interests go into other things. Being a part of a book club is also really helpful for me because sometimes I don't want to read, but because I'm in a book club, I kind of force myself to read, or I feel like I have to read, and then I push through and I finish the book, and then I end up really loving the book, and then I'm no longer in my slump. Obviously, this isn't always the case. If you join a Subtle Asian Book Club, we also have reading sprints. A reading sprint is when you basically just read for a certain amount of time, and that's all you do. How it works is that in our Discord server, we have a reading sprint channel. We'll set up a timer bot, and usually this will be anywhere from 10 minutes minutes to an hour. You'll read. Once the timer finishes up, it'll ping you and it'll be like, okay, time's up. You finished your reading sprint. And also everyone is reading their own books and reading at their own pace, but it does feel more motivating when I read during a reading sprint because, well, one, I have other people who are reading with me, even though sometimes I can't physically see them reading with me, and it's at the end of the day just like me by myself in front of my computer reading. And two, because specifically in our Discord we have this like ranking system of like who read the most pages, I feel like I don't want to stop in the middle to, I don't know, look at my phone and then eventually get distracted, because I want to keep reading and read more pages and like read at least at the same pace as everyone else. It does motivate me a little bit to keep going. Those are some like physical things that I do to put me in a physical space where I am forced to read, and it really helps give that like extra push when you're trying to get back into reading or you're just trying to read in general, but you need a little bit of accountability. Along those lines, add reading into your daily routine. This really helps me. And I think this is honestly the reason why I feel like I'm a reader now, because when I was deep in my slump, I would go months without reading, with the exception of the SABC books. So literally for a very long time, I would just only read the books from my book club and not anything else, because I just couldn't bring myself to read anything else for pleasure. And again, with the whole thing about time and being an adult and feeling like you don't have as much time, I felt like I didn't really have the time to read, and it was just this constant struggle. But once I added reading into my routine, I started to build it as a habit, and then like anything, you have to like build stamina. So I built my reading stamina, and then I got into the habit of like reading more just by adding it to my routine. What that looks like is that specifically for myself, I read before I go to sleep for around 30 minutes. I don't really put a timer because I feel like that stresses me out a little. I just read until I feel tired, because I have this low pressure thing where I literally tell myself it's okay if I only read for like, I don't know, like 5 minutes or something, but at least I read a little bit today. Then I feel like more motivated to just do it for fun and just to keep up this habit. But you don't have to necessarily add it to your evening routine. I know some people who have reading in their morning routine. If you really don't have time to like physically read, like sit down and read, another thing that has been super helpful for me getting me out of my slump or getting me out of times when I just don't feel as motivated to read is audiobooks. Audiobooks are game changer. I read so much when I'm reading on audiobook. If you're not as accustomed to audiobooks, or if you've like never read an audiobook and you try to read it for the first time, I know it can be a very big learning curve. Personally, when I first started reading audiobooks, I had a lot of trouble getting into the book and focusing. I like slowly trained myself to read audiobooks. If it really doesn't work for you, then obviously there's like, just don't read audiobooks. Like, you'll find other ways to read. But in my experience, you just have to push through. What really helps is to start with audiobooks of books that you have already read or books that you know are very simple. What I mean by that is, do not start getting into audiobooks with super intense high fantasies. And that's because the world itself is already really confusing, and a lot of times people, even like myself who like reads a lot of audiobooks, fantasies can be really confusing to like follow, because there's a lot of like new words that are specific to the world and you're like, what is this? One of the best audiobooks ever is Percy Jackson, the entire series, because the Percy Jackson series already has like super fun writing, and there's like a lot of banter, and it's like funny, and so it sounds a little bit like you're listening to like a podcast. That's an exaggeration, but whatever. And the narrator is really good, and I would assume a lot of people have read Percy Jackson as a kid, so that is a great series to start with on audiobook. It's so good. The narrator is so good. Other good like audiobook starters are contemporaries and maybe romance. Sometimes romance can get steamy, and so like when I hear it, I get like self-conscious and like I cringe a little. But when I'm actually reading it on a physical book, I'm like, this is so good. But yeah, so it's a hit or miss. I know a lot of people like to start with memoirs too, because you usually narrated by the person who wrote the book. So for example, I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy was narrated by Jeanette McCurdy. I listened to that on audiobook. I enjoyed that as an audiobook, but when I first started getting into audiobooks, I started with memoirs and I really had trouble getting into them, so I don't know if I would recommend per se. I would stick to rereading. And with that said, my final prescription is rereading old favorites when you're in a reading slump. Either rereading old favorites or reading from your comfort genres. So when I was younger, I really loved YA. It was like my favorite genre. But as I mentioned earlier, I kind of went through this like reading identity crisis when I grew out of being a teenager and I stopped feeling like YA was relatable. But sometimes when I'm in a slump, reading like a YA book really hits the spot because it's just something that I know is easy to get through. And same thing for middle grade, because reading more like intellectual books can be exhausting sometimes, because a lot of those times those books require a lot of engagement from the reader. It really encourages you to think, and that's the appeal of a lot of those genres. Like there's like a lot of like commentary about like life and the world and like class and like politics and all this other stuff. I think like is really good and I love those books, but at the same time it's exhausting to read them. So I don't think reading those books or like reading books in genres that are a little bit more challenging for you are good when you're trying to get into reading or trying to get out of a slump. That said, here are some book recommendations if you want to get into reading or want to get out of the slump, because these cured me. First up, we have Beach Read by Emily Henry. This book cured me. You don't understand. It cured me. I was ruined. I have not been I'm like tearing up. I have not been ruined by a book in a very long time. Like, you don't understand. If you haven't read an Emily Henry book, there's a reason why she's so popular. Everyone loves her for a good reason, because her books are so good. Beach Read is a contemporary romance about January and Gus, who are two authors. January, the main character, is an author who mostly writes about like romances and happy endings. Gus is also an author who does the complete opposite. He mostly writes about like dark things and everyone dies in the end. They end up somehow as neighbors and they decide to do this challenge where they're gonna like try to write each other's books because they're both in a writing slump, and they promise not to fall in love. Do you see how many tabs? Do you see how many tabs I have in here? I literally could not sleep because I was reading it. Like, ruined me and also cured me at the same time. You have no idea. I don't want to hype it too much because I don't want you to go into it with high expectations, but I loved it so much and it was so fun and it has ruined my life. Anyway, This Time It's Real by Anne Yang. This is a YA romance that also ruined me in the same way, because I also stopped doing everything in my life and finished this book in a day, and so good. Okay, this is a YA book, romance, enemies to lovers, fake dating. Those are my favorite tropes. Not real enemies to lovers, it's like rivals to lovers sort of, but they don't like each other in the beginning is the point. He's also super dreamy. If you liked To All the Boys I Loved Before, you will eat this up. Eat this up. This is so good. I finished it in a day, and then the next day I proceeded to reread all my favorite parts. And the day after that, I did the exact same thing. And then I proceeded to read all of Anne Yang's books because I was cured of my slump. I was like, this is what it feels like to read and enjoy things. Next up, we have What You're Looking For Is in the Library. There's 4 different stories that follows a general theme, but the stories are not connected together per se. The general theme that connects everyone and all the characters in What You're Looking For in the Library is this librarian who gives book recommendations, and the book recommendations seem at first kind of strange, but then they end up kind of like changing the characters' lives in some way, or or like impacting them in some way. Very cute and very wholesome. The characters are all in different stages in their lives. There's like someone who's like in their 20s, doesn't really know what they're doing. There's like someone who's like a bit older. It's really approachable and good for anybody, and anyone can read it and like enjoy it and relate to it and feel connected to it in some sort of way. This is also a Japanese translated book, and personally I feel like Japanese literature is more approachable because a lot of Japanese translated into English books have like more simple sentence structures and are a bit more straightforward. As a result, a lot of Japanese books are quite short. This obviously is not true for every single Japanese translated book, but in general, that is what I've noticed. So yeah, I think it's really good for people who are trying to get into reading, because a lot of the times reading can be intimidating, especially if there's like a lot of like plural sentences and extreme metaphors. Japanese literature is very tame, but really deep. Next are some books that are great if you're not super into romance. So first up we have Ruby Lost and Found by Christina Lee. I read this earlier this year and I loved it so much. I also binged this in a day and it also made me cry. This is a middle grade book, and I think middle grade is a wonderful genre for people who are trying to get into reading or getting out of a reading slump, because again, the writing is a bit more simple, so it's made for younger readers so they're able to understand, and a lot of times that's wonderful because again, when you're in a slump, you don't want to think. I love middle grade. Middle grade books also tend to make me cry because they're really deep. Ruby Lost and Found is set in the summer between 7th and 8th grade, and it is about a girl who is grieving her grandfather's death and also like navigating everything that comes with being like a preteen slash an early teen. It's set in San Francisco's Chinatown and it feels very close to home. Not because I personally grew up in San Francisco's Chinatown, but just because Ruby loves Chinatown so much that like I in turn feel like I'm physically there and I also want to root for that. It's just overall like so well done. I love this so much. You need to read this because it just makes me so emotional and I want people to cry with me. I'm tearing up again. Okay, I have to move on. The Queens of New York by E.L. Shen. I love this book so much and I feel like I talk about it all the time for good reason. This is often pitched as like Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, mostly because it's about friendship. It's about these 3 girls on the cover. Like, look at them, they're so beautiful. They're besties and they're born and raised in the Queens of New York. This is the first summer that they're all going to be in separate places and they're not spending the summer together. And so it's really lovely to watch all of these 3 different characters grow up on their own as individuals, but also together in their friendship while they're apart. And so it's a very friendship heavy book. It's a YA, so it's really like coming of age and like identity and like figuring out like what you want in life and first romances and family relationships and grief and all the good stuff, and I love it so much. It's so good. My last book is a book that I don't have with me, and that is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I love this book so much. I actually read it the first time on audiobook. Wait, I think I've only read it on audiobook. I think I've read it like 3 times and I'm surprised, but every single time it gets better, because sometimes when I read a book I'm like, oh, like this was so good, but then when you read it again you realize that like it wasn't as good as you remembered. But Evelyn Hugo was as good as I remember and maybe even better, which is insane because I loved it so much. I think 7 Husbands is wonderful for people who want to get into reading because it checks off a lot of boxes. It has like a great setting and vibe. This is a contemporary fiction novel and it follows the life of Evelyn Hugo, who was this famous 1960s, 70s, 80s star. She was like a star and a legend. Like imagine like Madonna level fame. And it's like really like old Hollywood vibes because she's like talking about like her life. And it's super interesting because I feel like that era and like that life is something that a lot of people are naturally interested in because it's just like so glamorous. And it's also great because there's like drama happening like throughout her life because, you know, she's a star. And also, who are her 7 husbands? Why does she have 7 husbands? The last thing that's great is that it's not just about the romances and it's not just about like the glamour and the glitz. It's also really just about Evelyn Hugo. You really see her grow as a person throughout her life and the relationships that are really powerful to her and the people that have like really shaped her as a person. And I can really imagine her as like a real person. I think it's really approachable for a lot of readers. I hope you found some helpful tips and I hope this cures your reading slump, and I'm rooting for you. Thank you for watching, sending you good vibes and good reads, and I will see you next time. Bye!